Church, as we continue our study in the book of Jonah, we find today that we're going to look at all 10 verses of chapter 2 as we talk about Jonah, the runaway prophet, and we're going to specifically talk about how he returned to God. Now, not so much around here, we have a lot of flatlands, but if you live in the mountains, you've seen those runaway ramps for trucks. Anybody know what I'm talking about? It'll be at the end of the bottom of a mountain kind of, and then you go up into some gravel or whatever it is that they have, and you roll up in there. I've often thought I'd like to try that as fast as I can and just hit that thing and see what happens. But I've never done that. I've thought about it. But trucks use those when their brakes go out. It's a last resort. There's nothing else they can do. And that's kind of what we're going to see Jonah do today. He's going to go and he's going to hit that runaway ramp, and it's going to be through prayer and brokenness that he finally surrenders to God and he returns home to God. The runaway prophet comes home. I was reading a story recently about runaways, and it was a story about a little boy who decided he was going to run away because he got in trouble with his father. So he got his clothes together, he got his piggy bank together and his teddy bear. He gathered those items and he declared to his dad, said, "Dad, I'm running away from home." So the dad decided he thought he'd ask a few questions before he left. So he said, question number one, he asked three. The first one he asked, he says, "What if you get hungry? What are you going to do?" He thought for a second. He said, "Well, I'll come home and get some food." He said, "Well, what if you run out of money?" He thought for a second. He said, "Well, I'll come home and ask you for some." And then he had a last question, and he said, "Well, what if your clothes get dirty?" He said, "Well, of course, I'll come home and ask Mom to wash them." And the dad paused for a second. He said, "This boy's not running away from home. He sounds like he's going off to college." Well, Jonah, the runaway prophet, when he returns home, he couldn't do it on his terms. He had to do it on God's terms. And that's what we're going to look at today. You know, what is involved in returning to God? Do we even need to return to God? Why should we return to God? All of these questions will be raised and answered in the context of these 10 verses today. This is a spiritual process, and I want to remind you today, remember what God is up to. He is asking Jonah to go and preach the gospel to Nineveh. This is about a whole rogue nation returning to God. And Jonah's unwilling to do that. And we can't forget that that's what this is all about, is God's will and calling the nation of Nineveh back to himself, or to himself for the first time. And Jonah is a part of that process. This whole spiritual process is conditional, and Jonah needs to figure out how it works. It's on God's terms, not his. There's a very famous verse that you've probably heard quoted or written, shared, even during this time of election. It's 2 Corinthians 7:14 that says, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." It's a very well-used verse. Many of us know that by heart. We've seen that in many places, but we fail to fully grasp its meaning. And the reason I want to talk about it briefly here in the introduction of this message is it deals with the conditional part that is our responsibility. The verse begins with the "if my people who are called by my name will," if and will do these things, and the main thing is to humble themselves. And see, that's what Jonah does in this text. He truly comes in humility before God. And once you're humble, then you can do these things. Pray, seek my face, turn from your wicked ways. And that's really what Jonah does. He does all those things in his humility. And once he does those, then God says, "Then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land." See, the "if" is conditional. The "then" is conditional upon the "if." And if we will humble ourselves, then God will hear from heaven, will forgive our sins, and will heal our land. Now that's true for Jonah personally. In any way that you look at it, I look at my own life and times that I have run from God and I've returned to Him. It is a culmination of the if and then. If I will return. God never left, I left. And if I will return to Him, if I'll humble myself, then God will do what He needs to do to heal me so that I can listen and obey. And you cannot separate these things. You cannot return to God and say, God, I'm going to come home and I want all the benefits, but I don't want to do anything that you want me to do. It doesn't work that way. You can't say, I want it my way when I return. It doesn't work like that. The prodigal son knew that. When he came to his senses in the pig pen, he said, I will return to God because I have sinned against Him. And I'm going to go and I'm going to do whatever the Father asks me to do. And that's the way it has to be. It's got to be on God's terms, God's way, because He knows what is best. He's calling us back from our rebellion and our running to renew us and revive us, but we must understand it's His way, not our way. Personal renewal is living God's way for His renown, not our own. Now, are you willing to do that? Are you really willing to fully humble yourself? For Jonah, he had to get down to this very last moment of his life to decide that he would return. And when we return, what we're saying is simply this: God, I'm going to make you the center of my life. Not a part of my life, but the center of my life. You're going to be my everything. And I'm going to fall in love with you all over again. And in so doing, whatever you say, I will do. And that's what happened for Jonah. And I want to show you exactly how this happened through these 10 verses by sharing with you 7 things that were involved in Jonah's personal return to God. You say, well, I feel like I'm doing pretty good with God. Well, then share it with someone else that may need it. But it may be that you are not exactly fully returned to the Lord. And one of these points is going to speak to you and minister to you. Take it to heart. You'll never regret it. Apply it in your life. Let me give you these 7. The first is this. What was involved in this return? We see in verse 1 that prayer is a part, obviously. This is the communication that's reestablished. He's talking to God again. But he's coming and he's being honest with God. He's being broken before God. He's praying in humility with God. This is not a pray for the meal kind of prayer where we do it in routine and we don't even realize what we're saying. This is a brokenness in the presence of God, communicating with God as we ought to pray. And here's what it says in verse 1. In these first several, I will touch on them very quickly, and because we've looked at these, but we need to kind of see the full picture all at one time. So prayer, verse 1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He had not been doing that. He'd been running from God. He didn't want to talk to God, but now he's praying to God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and He answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. We learned last week that he was amazed that God would even listen to him, much less answer him, because he assumed God had given up on him and judgment was coming, but that was not the case. And when we look at the prayer that he prayed here, we should note that Jonah is not praying for those living in Nineveh. Do you hear any prayer about the Ninevites, about how they should repent and what they should do? Not at all. This is not a prayer about the Ninevites like, Lord, change the Ninevites. Instead, it's, Lord, change me. This prayer is a personal prayer. This is all about Jonah, his heart, his rebellion, his willingness to return, his willingness to obey, his willingness to go, his willingness to humble himself before God. I mean, this is all about him. Are you willing to pray that way? Have you ever prayed that way? Have I prayed that way? The answer is yes, I have. And I know this is where real freedom comes. This is where a relationship is reestablished as it should be. But we don't really like to pray this way. This introspective praying that looks at the spiritual condition of our heart. How many of you like to go to the doctor and hear him say, hey, you need to lose a few pounds. Hey, you need to exercise more. You need to eat a little different. And hey, I see a little something here in your numbers that I don't like, and you're going to have to make some changes. And we're like, man, I don't think I want to hear all that, right? When somebody gets introspective about your health, you're like, oh gosh, that means I got to change some things. And so we don't like to pray about that spiritually either. We don't like to really open up our heart and say, oh God, show me absolutely anything you want to show me about my heart. But I'm telling you that renewed relationship with God will not come until we're fully broken before Him in that way. And say, God, say anything to me that you want to say. Show me anything and I'll make it right. But this is how Jonah is praying. You know, the old spiritual hymn that said, it's not my brother nor my sister, but it's me, O Lord, standing in the need of prayer. That's where Jonah is. He said, it's me. It's a prayer of urgency. It's a prayer in distress that he says he called on the Lord. And it's out of the depths of the grave that he calls for help. And you've got to understand, in all that happened when the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and Jonah left the presence of God, and he runs and he spends his money. He's going to get on a ship, and the whole deal that happens in the waves and the storm, and now he's swallowed by a fish. He's at his tipping point. And he's either going to give up and die, or he is going to get right with God. It's one or the other. And what we see amazingly is he gets right with God. It's beautiful. It's powerful. And that's what you and I need to do. We need to understand how to do this. Beautiful. He prayed. But out of this prayer comes, secondly, an acknowledgement. And these are the things that help us understand that his praying and humility is real. It's not false. It's not fake. He's not making a case for justification with God. He truly is getting right with God. And we see this in verse 3. He says, you hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. If you would underline the word you and your, what you're seeing here is a reverence on Jonah's part toward God. He's acknowledging the activity of God in his life. And when you and I get right with God and we humble ourselves before Him, we see that God has been doing things out of love toward us. You did this, your ways, your way. You've been actively working in my life. And it's a reverence toward Him that you're able to acknowledge this isn't just some happenstance or a set of circumstances that nature has created, and we just say, oh, these things happen all the time. No, we begin to see and realize God's been working in our lives, and you give acknowledgement, and there's a reverence to God in that regard. And that's what you see in verse 3. And then in verse 4, what you see is there is a looking. He said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The re-looking, the looking again, is a change of mind. He's not running from. He said, no, I'm going to turn and I'm going to look to you again, is what he's saying. And when you have a change of mind, that's a change of direction, that is the definition of repentance. Is to turn away from your own way and turn back to God and His way. And that's what you see here, a re-looking. So what we have so far is that he is praying in true humility. He's acknowledging God in his activity in his life. He's looking again to God. And now 4, we see the rescue, verses 5 through 7. He said, the engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath bared me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit. Oh, Lord, my God, when my life was ebbing away. That ebbing away is a descriptor of all of verse 5 and 6, or the first part of 6, of what was happening. He said, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, Lord, to your holy temple. So you see where his focus is. And what he is acknowledging here is, God, that you rescued me. This is a continual description of what he began in verse 3, of his downward plunge into the deep. It's a vivid picture of his hopeless situation. He is literally in over his head and beyond, listen to me, beyond any human help. He said, my life was ebbing away. And we should stop and pause and think about that. Have you ever experienced something like that? See, it's hard to grasp. what is going on in his life, because you and I have never been thrown into the sea, sinking down into the depth, seaweed around our head. No human help can help. No one can help you. You're beyond human help. And you're literally, there's seconds left. My life is literally ebbing away. You ever felt that hopeless? You ever been in a situation quite like that? A number of years ago, we took a group, when we were pastoring in North Carolina, up to the Nantahala to do some rafting. And we went through all of our training. We had a big group from our church, and we got on the rafts and had our helmets and our paddles, and everybody had their position on the rafts. And then they released the water, and the water comes rushing out. And now you've got a current strong enough, powerful enough to get you down the river, but it's also powerful enough to take your life. And as we began, we had one group, several groups, but there was one group behind us that had some of our friends that were on that particular raft. Ronnie and Kathy, you've probably met them before, a married couple. And on that raft, as they began down the river and the current began to flow, the raft began to shift. And as it did, Kathy fell out of the raft. And as she fell into this current that was swirling, the raft went over her and trapped her under for a time. And then she popped back up and no one could reach her. And then she was in a current that was so strong, it sucked her under. And as she is under the water fighting to come up, she finally pops up near the other side from where the raft is, on the other bank. And her husband is calling out to her, Kathy, hey, Kathy, are you okay? We'll try to make our way over and get you. And she crawled up on the bank and said, don't worry about it, I am done. And she walked back to the bus. And I'm going to tell you, it was so frightening, she's never been back in the water since. In fact, she has a hard time. They have a lake house and a boat. She has a hard time even going out on the boat. It was such a traumatic experience for her. She said, I was fighting for my life. I could not breathe. I could not get back up. I could not make... But see, when you have an experience like that, literally where you know your life is going to end. Now, we're talking about serious business here. And that's literally what it took for Jonah to come to the end. Why do we have to fight so hard against God? You say, well, God's just hard and he's rough. Listen, don't miss the value of brokenness and the discipline of God to get our attention. It's required that pride must be broken for spiritual growth to come. And I am telling you that Jonah was prideful. He was determined in his own strength to do the exact opposite of what God was calling him to do. And he went through this tremendous breaking. But once he is saved, he's got this honesty about him. And he says in verse 3, God, you hurled me into the deep. Then he says in verse 2, you listened to my cry. He says then in verse 6, God brought Jonah up from the pit. He's acknowledging God did that. God hurled him. God listened. God brought. This is all an act and a work of God. And he said this, he said that he remembered God. And to remember is to return. And it's a beautiful picture of what Jonah is recounting about his experience. And he said, man, I'm looking again to the Almighty God who did all of these things in my life out of love and mercy and grace, and I'm returning to Him. It's beautiful. But it was at the very end of his life. It was ebbing away. The fifth thing I want you to see is the gratefulness that came out of his life. Verse 8. He says, those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. They forfeit the grace that could be theirs. How could Jonah say this? Why would Jonah say this? We got to kind of slow down. I know I could get excited and just start preaching. But we need to really pull it back and slow down for a second and talk about this. The reason Jonah puts verse 8 in here is this. This was his problem. This was his sin issue. Is that Jonah, listen, Jonah was an idolater. That was his problem. And you and I can easily become idolaters. And so we need to explore and identify our idols and learn how to remove them from our lives. After all that Jonah had been through, this whole journey away from God, now returning to God, he comes to the concluding position, don't cling to worthless idols. It's like that could have been his message to all of God's people. Hey, you, don't cling to worthless idols. Hey, you, don't cling to worthless idols. I am telling you, it's not worth it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's not worth it. And I would agree. The other day, I had to switch a battery for something. I don't know if it was in a clock or something that it was in, and the battery had died, and I took it out and looked at it. It looked pretty good. It didn't look bad. It looked good, but it wasn't working anymore. And I thought, well, that's a good battery. Doesn't that look good? Should I just put it back with all the good batteries? And then we'll see when somebody pulls that out, they think it's good, and then it's not good. But anyway, you say the battery's good. It looks good. So I'm going to cling to it. No, let me tell you something about that battery. I would say this, that battery's dead. What good's the battery? It is worthless. Why should I keep it? You say, you're crazy. You're not going to keep a dead battery. Go throw it in the trash. Get rid of it. What good is it? It's useless, lifeless, dead. Exactly. When you and I cling to worthless idols that are dead, they're not real. They're worthless. They're lifeless. What's the point? But yet we cling to them. Why do we do it? Jonah says, foolish to forfeit. Listen, what you're forfeiting is the grace of God for worthless idols. I want to give you an acronym, DIRT, D-I-R-T. And this will help you deal with idols in your life if you can remember that word dirt. Can anybody remember the word dirt? Here's how you get rid of the worthless idols so you don't forfeit the grace of God. First, you got to define. That's the D. You got to define what an idol is. An idol is not just some object of devotion that replaces God. It's whatever is more important to us than God. That's what an idol is. And we give it more time. We give it more attention. It's not something that we're willing to give up. We just put it above God. That's an idol. You say, well, didn't they have a golden calf in Scripture? Of course they did. They created that and they worshiped that. And so then we think, okay, those are idols. Those are things that are dead. They're worthless. In our culture today, what do we have? What do you have? I mean, it could be anything. It could be your time. It could be your schedule. It could be a person. It could be an object. It could be a gold car. If you want to say that, I don't know anybody who drives a gold car. But my point is, whatever it is that you put above God, that gets your time, attention, energy, emotions, that you give more to that than you do to God. Anything that supersedes God becomes an idol. Exodus 23-6 tells us, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make, that is, man-made, idols for yourself, an idol and in the form of anything from heaven above or earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. That is to focus on the creation of the Creator. For I, the Lord your God, am, I love this actually, I love this. I am a jealous God. God jealous. He's a jealous God for us. He said, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation to those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations to those who love me and keep my commandments. If we keep his commandments, see, that's where Jonah went sideways. If we keep his commandments, it will remove the idols in our lives. Idols truly are worthless, which raises the question, why do we cling to them? Because we think they have value. We think they bring purpose to us. And we spend time and resources to secure and maintain them. You got to define what an idol is. That's the first part, dirt. Let me give you the I. You got to identify, that is, inventory your life. So Jonah inventories his life. Jonah knows what his idol is. Jonah knows why he disobeyed. See, when the word of the Lord comes and we say, no, Lord, I won't do it, I'm going to do other things, it means we're holding on to something we're unwilling to let go of in order to obey God. So whatever it is that we hold on to so we don't obey, that's the idol. So what was the idol for Jonah? It was his heritage. He was a Hebrew. He knew God and experienced God's grace and salvation. But he didn't want to share God with his enemies. His idol was his self-appointed authority on where and to whom God would extend his grace. And you got to really think about this. I mean, this is so prideful. It is so arrogant. It is so off the charts that Jonah says to God, God, I hear you loud and clear. I know what you're asking me to do, but I refuse to do it because I don't think it's a good idea. In fact, I know it's not a good idea, so I won't do it. I'm out of here. He's putting God in his place about his creation and his salvation. And that was his idol. He lifted his ethnicity and his prophetic role above God himself. And I stopped and I think, Lord, what have I done and what have I put between you and me that causes me to disobey your clear command? You know, when the Lord called me into ministry, I could have made a lot of cases of why I shouldn't go. In fact, God and I had some of those conversations, like, I've seen some hardness in ministry. I've seen some unjust things happen in ministry. I could list a lot of different church hurts and things like, well, God, I'm not really qualified for this, and I don't really want to do this, and well, how can I do that? And I mean, I had a whole list of things that God and I talked about. And if I had clinged to those, I would have forfeited the grace of God. I would have missed God's will. And I said, God, I know better for my life than you do for me. Now, that's true in every stage of my life, but I'm just talking about that when God was calling me into ministry. We do it all the time. We debate God. We justify things. We hold on to things. But if you really want to know God's full grace, mercy, and you don't forfeit that, you've got to come to a point to say, God, you own it all. You know best. When I settle what the voice of God is, the clear command that you have called me to, I will say, yes, Lord, not no, Lord. And that's how you get rid of those idols. You got to do, this is hard. Listen. When you do this identifying, this inventory, it is very personal and it's hard. But you should realize, idols that you and I hold on, they can excite, but they cannot fulfill whatever it is. It could be a car, a person, a dream. They cannot be put above God. He must be first. Now let me give you the third on the dirt. And it's the R, and it's the word release. That is to cling no more. It is to loosen your grip. It is to cast away the idol, right? You got to put it to death. Colossians 3, 5, and 6 says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, even which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You've got to release. You've got to remove them, release them from your life. I was watching a video recently of some young baseball players, and they would hit the ball, and once they hit it out, they have a certain way they like to kind of flip the bat as they make their way around the bases. But I've also seen some videos of young players who are just starting out. They'll hit the ball. If they hit it out, they don't know any better, but they just hold the bat as they run all the way around the bases. That doesn't seem right, does it? You're supposed to throw the bat down. I saw one little boy grab the bat, and he goes to first, goes to second, comes all the way home. He's still got the bat. And everybody's like, he won't release it. And everybody's screaming and yelling, release it, let it go, drop the bat. But that's how you and I are. We may know what our idol is, but we won't let go of it. You've got to release it. To cling, to run the bases with that bat, which is the idol that's in your life. Let me tell you something. When you do that, you choose to forfeit what? The grace of God in your life. I like what Elizabeth Elliot said, and she was a very mature, God-filled person. She said, the Christian life is a process of God breaking our idols one by one. I learned the hard way how true that is. God loves us too much to let anything come between us and Him. As we grow older, God pulls our fingers away from the things we value the most. And in the end, there is nothing left but God. He'll loosen that grip until we can let go of whatever it is. You say, why would God do that? Because He's a jealous God. Jealous of what? He's jealous for you, not of you. See, He's God. He's way above you. He's way above me. But He's jealous for you. He is a jealous God. And then the T is simply this. Fourthly, you got to turn away. Once you release the idol, whatever that is for your life, you release it, you got to turn away from it, you look again to God, and you got to go His way. Please understand, when Jonah said, if you can't release your idols, you're going to forfeit the grace of God, he knew exactly what he was talking about. He knew exactly what he was talking about. And once you apply dirt in your life, here's what happens. Verse 9, it's worship. This is so beautiful. He says, but I, with a song of thanksgiving. What? What a transition, right? The one who wouldn't even talk to God, who ran from God, who couldn't even acknowledge God. Here he is with a song of thanksgiving. He says, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed, I will make good. What? Yeah, that's what he said. Salvation comes from the Lord. You see, he's willing to say, okay, salvation is for anyone and everyone, and I'm going to obey. I'll make the vow good. I'm going to go. That's what he's saying. And so when we stop clinging to idols, we can start grasping hold of God. And when we grasp hold of God, we start praising Him out of gratefulness because of His grace. Some of the most beautiful worship that will ever happen in your life is in true humility. Hands lifted up, saying, God, I'm nothing, you're everything. Whatever you say, I'll do. I'll get rid of all my idols, whatever they are. Full surrender is what we talk about. And then there's this beautiful worship of praising Him, the willingness to serve Him, to go wherever He says to go, and sharing Him. That, I was always told by my professors in seminary, you want to know if revival, that is renewal among believers, is true? You'll know it if there's a willingness on their part to share the gospel wherever God leads, with whomever God sends them. And it's true. There's just like this willingness to say, I'll talk to whoever, whenever, however you want me to, God. And that's when the church is set on fire. That's when individuals are set on fire. We identify that. We say they're experiencing revival. Look, they're out sharing the gospel. In all of this, we can conclude Jonah learned he could not take God's commands lightly. When the word of the Lord comes, we must learn to obey. And then there is the seventh thing that occurred. This is verse 10, and it's restoration. He's restored to his walk with God, his call upon his life from God. And it says in verse 10, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. You know, it's interesting in the Hebrew, the literal rendering of that first part of the verse is, and the Lord spoke to the fish. You say, why is that interesting? Because when the Lord spoke to Jonah, he did not obey. When he spoke to the fish, he didn't ask him questions. He just did what he was told to do. Spit him out. Get rid of him. He's ready. And the fish obeys and spits him up on shore. When we're ready, God delivers us, puts us where we're supposed to be. You could put it this way, until we are spittable, we are not suitable for serving God. Spit up on land, ready to serve the living God in what He's asked us to do. Jonah here, you say, man, what a journey. What a journey that it took for him to fall in love with God all over again. You want to talk about a beautiful picture of a love story. But that's really what's going on. He's offering his life to the Lord as a living sacrifice to be used for God's glory. He's saying to him, I need you and you alone. God, you're my everything. I cannot find my existence anywhere else. You know, I had an interesting experience take place in my life a number of years back when we were pastoring in North Carolina. And I've told you this story before, but the reason I'm going to tell it to you again in brief format is because I had some of these, what I think are the same feelings that Jonah had. Not that I was deliberately running from God, but God was speaking to me and wanted me to listen to some things that maybe I wouldn't have been open to listen to if I didn't go through the experience that I went through. I don't know, but it happened. I was on my way from Roxborough, North Carolina, up to Durham, North Carolina to make a hospital visit. I was driving down a 4-lane highway with a center lane, so 5 lanes, flat, open, no cars around, running about 40 miles an hour in a Jeep Cherokee, just driving along, headed up to the hospital. And as I'm driving along, all of a sudden, the wheel on the vehicle begins to shake violently. To the right, to the left, to the left, to the right, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. And all of a sudden, this whole thing is happening. I'm like, what in the world is going on? And I'm in the left lane, the right lane, left lane. I can't control it. And all of a sudden, I veer off the road, and I smash into a telephone pole. I get out. My face is bleeding. I have blood all over me. And I begin to walk around. I'm in a daze. Some cars pull up behind me, and I must have looked a mess because I walked up to this car behind me, and the guy looks flushed in the face, white. He goes, "Are you okay? You look horrible." I said, "Oh, well, thanks." I said, "I think I'm okay." He said, "Man, you got blood all over you." And I had a bunch of facial lacerations, and they bleed a lot. And I looked pretty rough, obviously. I could walk, but I was sore. I could move around. I began to try to figure out what happened. My vehicle was totaled. My back right wheel, the axle had come apart. I was riding on 3 wheels. They found the wheel and the axle out in the field with the axle up in the air, still attached to the tire. So the cogs, the whole axle had come apart like this, and this wheel just came off and went out in the field. And when I hit the telephone pole, the wheel well hit the kind of semicircle wheel well, hit the telephone pole just like this, dead center. So when it did, it just smashed it right there. You say, well, what's significant about that is simply this. The wheel wasn't on there. It had already come off and rolled out into the field, and that's where I hit the telephone pole. If I hadn't hit the telephone pole, I probably would have rolled and died. But I hit the telephone pole. So the record comes, ambulance, all those people come, all that whole deal. But I'm fine. I go home. I get a ride home. I don't remember who took me home, but I went home, and I remember walking around. Michelle said to me, said, "Mark, just draw a circle around yourself and have revival." I said, "Okay." I said, "I'm going to do that." I said, "God, what are you doing? What are you saying?" And I remember just having this overwhelming sense of what Jonah said. He said, my life was ebbing away. It's like my life just flashed before me in those seconds. And I had this overwhelming realization, I literally could have died. I called my sister and I was talking to her, and she said, "Mark," she said, "God still has a plan for your life. He kept you alive. He's trying to say something to you." And in that moment of brokenness before God, see, there's a reverence to say, "God, you saved my life. God, you did this." That's what Jonah did. "God, I'll let go of whatever you want me to let go of, and I'll do whatever it is you want me to do." We'd recently built a house. We were settled in. But out of that, I knew that God was going to lead us to a different ministry. We would eventually end up moving to Atlanta. But I wasn't sure about that. I wasn't sure what to do, where to go. He would actually ask me to go do something I never thought I would do. But I had an openness to that when it came into my life, which I probably would have never had an openness to. I had not gone through this accident. But I had this openness to say, "Lord, I'll do whatever it is you want me to do." Part of it was to go back to school and work on my doctor's degree. Part of it was to move away from the home and the community God had placed us in. And just all of that. It's just a full surrender. But I had this openness because literally I realized death or obedience. And I said, "Lord, I'll obey." And so that microcosm feeling that I had maybe is a speck of what Jonah felt and realized. And he said, don't forfeit the grace of God. Get rid of your idols. Obey God. And that is really the message. This is the message. I want to say to you, if you want renewal with God as Jonah experienced, please know renewal will never come to a proud heart that does not need God. He will break our pride at all costs to make us dependent upon Him. And renewal will never come to those who rationalize their sin instead of repenting of their sin. It just won't happen. You say, I want renewal. I want to be right with God. Then it may take some tough knocks and some real honesty for God to be God in your life fully. And the question is, are you willing to let Him do it? Let's go to the Lord in prayer.